Go ahead, Mia.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Mia Tamburi, Program Director of Cancer Bridges and a member of the Education and Outreach Work Group for Cancer in the Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania. Today's presentation is Fracking Impacts, Community Concerns and What the Science Tells Us. Based at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Public Health Training Center is part of the national network of public health training centers that are funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration. Serving as the central office, they collaborate with community-based training partners and the development and delivery of training opportunities to the current and future public health workforce. Appearing on this slide are their partners. These partners include academic institutions, public health organizations and agencies, and networks of community health centers. If you happen to get disconnected, please log back into the webinar. And if you need technical assistance, please send a message via the chat box. Also, please enter your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the presentation. The speaker series is a project of the Education and Outreach Work Group for the Cancer and Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania, which is composed of organizations and individuals who are concerned about the environmental chemicals and how they are contributing to our region's high rate of cancer. The organizations co-sponsoring today's webinar are Cancer Bridges, formerly Our Clubhouse and Cancer Caring Center. At Cancer Bridges, we provide support for those impacted by cancer, included counseling, support groups, health and wellness classes, family and youth activities, and much more. Young Adult Survivors United, a community in Western Pennsylvania for young adult cancer survivors and their co-survivors, and Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. LLS focuses on blood cancers and improving the quality of life of patients and their families through research, education, policy, and advocacy. The websites for these organizations will be found in the chat. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers, Heaven Sensky and Laura Dagley. Heaven is a Washington County local and the organizing director with the Center for Coalfield Justice. She primarily serves Washington and Greene counties around issues of oil and gas development. Her campaigns include advocating around the local childhood cancer crisis, advocating for harm reduction in relation to the opioid epidemic, and the intersections of racial and environmental justice. She is a graduate of American University, Washington, D.C. with a bachelor's degree in communications, law studies, and economics and government. Heaven serves as a co-chair of the External Advisory Board for the PA Environmental Health Study. Laura is a registered nurse and the medical advocacy coordinator for Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pennsylvania. She has worked in hospitals, home health, and hospice settings where she began to connect her patients' health to their environment. She now works in Pittsburgh as an advocate for healthcare providers, their patients, and the environments they live in. Her focus is educating on the research surrounding the health impacts from the oil and gas industry, where she reviewed research, testified as an expert witness, and organized continuing medical educations for healthcare providers and coordinated outreach around Physicians for Social Responsibility's compendium. Welcome, Heaven and Laura.
Thank you. I'm able to get started now. Is that okay? You'll have to excuse the banner behind me. My sister-in-law is graduating from high school today, so I'm excited to be hosting her after party. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how fracking is posing a risk to our communities, and Laura is going to follow up with some of the existing research that helps us to understand what's happening. So I'm going to be talking a lot about waste today. There are lots of parts of fracking that can pose risk. This is the part that we're really mostly concerned about in our communities. And so I'm going to be talking about keeping hazardous waste out of our communities and what folks can do to help us take action and see some really tangible change. All right, so if you know anything about fracking, we're going to go over the details here now. So this is an image of the fracking process. This is an image created by NRDC. If you can see here on the left-hand side, This is a water truck and a waste truck, right? And so fracking essentially starts at the wellhead, which if you can see my mouse cursor, this is where it starts. They're going to go down vertically and out in the shale layer. And what they do is they use lots of chemicals and sand and lots of water to essentially prime the well. So if you've ever had to prime a pump or anything like that, I always bring up when we're giving presentations, I remember doing a science experiment in high school where you put a straw into some water and you got the water to come out of the straw. That's essentially what they're doing whenever they're drilling a well. And so what they're doing is they're using lots of chemicals and sand, like I said, and water to push into the shale layer and frack at it. And so you get these fissures, right? These fractures in the shale layer as it cracks. Natural gas comes out. What they do through the water here, right? You're drilling through the groundwater. They are encasing these wells with concrete, right? If you're familiar with any violations that are happening in our communities, these fail, right? And it's kind of hard to tell when they do. And so that's a major problem of concern, right? Groundwater contamination. The other thing we're concerned about is we're ending up in a situation where there is a lot of waste produced. So what goes into the well is going to come back out. Behind it will come the gas. Right now, the chemicals that they use to frack with are considered proprietary. And so when I'm serving community members that are concerned about their water due to the drilling that's happening literally in their backyards, I'm really unable to get a comprehensive understanding of what's in their water. And the reason for that is because we don't know what to test for. And if you know anything about water testing, you can't just drop it into a machine and it tell you everything that's in the water, right? You have to look for what you're testing for. And so we're trying to get an idea and some sort of signs of fracking contamination, but it doesn't really help us understand entirely what people are being exposed to. And so that's a major problem. Over here on the right-hand side, there's a tank. They're storing gas in there, excuse me, not gasoline, natural gas. They're storing gas in there and they're essentially piping it out through gathering lines through rural communities to processing facilities. There are some issues, some safety issues that come about with that. Essentially, gas is a lot safer to move through a pipeline than it is on roads. But what has happened is they've built a lot of pipelines in our communities very quickly. And there's a lot of concern around that. There's a lot of mine subsidence here. They're not regularly monitoring the pipelines. The gas has not been processed, so it's not odorized. So there's concern for safety in our communities. I live next to a pipeline right now, and the company actually sends us a pamphlet every year that tells us we need to be walking the pipeline and looking for dead grass so we can tell them if it's leaking. I don't remember signing up for being responsible for their pipeline, but that's a totally different conversation for another day. So I hope that by now you've gotten a chance to kind of get a detailed look at this image. Essentially, waste is not supposed to be moved in the same trucks as quote unquote fresh water. That's kind of hard to keep track of for us. It's not very clear what's happening. But this is the general process that we're going to be talking about today. All right, so is it gas production or is it waste production? This image is courtesy of the organization Earthworks. They've done a lot of studies around how much waste is actually being produced, particularly in Pennsylvania. So right now there's almost 2,000 gas wells just in Washington County alone. We are the most fracked county in Pennsylvania, and there's fracking happening in Greene and all around us, right? A single well pad is going to produce 160,000 gallons of waste within the first 5 days of production. Post drilling, it's going to produce up to 1,100 gallons of liquid waste every day for another 10 to 30 years. They drill multiple times on a well pad. So just because there's almost 2,000 well pads doesn't mean that there's only 2,000 drilling operations, right? So they're going to come back to each well pad and drill multiple times. The oil and gas industry produced over 2.9 billion gallons of liquid waste in Pennsylvania in 2018. And they have been drilling more and more and more since then. So more recent numbers are going to be much higher. Liquid waste is typically stored on site. That means on the well pads and pits or tanks. This is not industrial property. It's not industrial land. It's family farms, rural communities, neighborhoods. Some of it is reused, and it all ends up, some of it is reused. Some of it ends up being injected back into the ground in Ohio where we're shipping it to. Some of it gets discharged into waterways after processing. Some of it ends up at landfills. Some of it is used for other applications, right? Sometimes they're going to use it to salt our roads or dampen down dust, things like that. We're working really hard to try to find out where all the waste is going. Wastewater is often referred to as flowback, produced water, brine, or effluent from treatment facilities. The reason we break down those terms is because a lot of workers don't know what they're in, right? I have a lot of friends that are young, that work for the industry, and they get into these wastewater containments up to their neck sometimes, and their superiors just tell them that it's brine. Okay, well, brine is waste. It's not just salt water, but many of the workers don't know that. It also ends up in the form of leachate, right? So that's what's coming off of landfills, things like that. That's just liquid waste, right? And so there's an in-between. There are drilling muds and sludge. And this is material that comes out of the earth, right? And is solid. There's pipe scale. So as they're moving produced gas through pipelines, they have to clean those pipelines because there's buildup inside of the lines. And there is, of course, solid waste, and this is mostly disposed of in landfills. These are drill cuttings. This is drill cuttings coming out of the ground, including drilling additives, which is chemicals. It's fracking sand, which is not like the sand you play with at the beach. It's silica sand, so it's very fine particulate matter and poses a great risk for air quality. Solid waste includes liners of pits, contaminated soil where production was taking place, tanks and equipment. Imagine how many trucks, tanks, and equipment have been retired over the course of the last decade. So this is a little bit about, this goes into detail a little more of what is being produced when we're talking about these hundreds of thousands of gallons of waste. Essentially, we don't know everything that they're fracking with, but whenever we do test where we know that waste is being exposed to, we're finding things like lead, benzene, and radium. Radium is naturally occurring in Pennsylvania soil. Most people that live here know that. If you've ever overseen any type of construction in your home or you moved into a new home, it's often that you'll be required to have a radon test done in your basement. That's because radium is in the soil. If you dug a swimming pool in your backyard, there might be more radon in your yard, right? Like in the air while that's happening. So it only makes sense that if you're drilling deep into the depths of the earth and pulling everything out with it, that there's going to be radium present, right? How much is present, where it's going, and what amount people are being exposed to is what we don't know. And we're going to talk a little more about that. Okay, so this is just some more information about liquid waste. So this is where we're talking a little bit about, okay, what's in the waste, right? We're talking about how scary this waste is. Recently, there's been more studies released that are showing the presence of forever chemicals that they're using to frack with all over the place in our rural places where our cattle graze, where we're farming, where people are frequenting the land and living here. It's a major problem. Unfortunately, oftentimes when we have this conversation to regulatory agencies, we hear the term density a lot. There's not a lot of people that live here, so it's okay, I guess, to expose folks to this. A 2011 analysis by federal scientists found that there were concentrations of radium roughly 40 times what the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission classifies as hazardous in fracking waste, in drilling waste. So a lot of times when we have this conversation, people are like, okay, well, can you show me a study that's not from an environmental group or that's not from environmentalists? And the fact of the matter is that they're out there and they do exist. This picture on the bottom left-hand corner is actually in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, in Greene County. This is a picture of a tanker truck. If you've ever frequented a rural place, you've seen one of these trucks before. I pass probably 10 or 15 a day just on my way to work. They're everywhere. The folks driving these trucks are contracted laborers, so they don't always know what they're hauling. The waste is not considered hazardous. We're going to get into that a little bit. And so the folks transporting it aren't being treated in a way that protects them. And it's all over our roads, right? These trucks leak. There's accidents. If this truck were to wreck on my rural road right now, it would not be cleaned up as a hazardous waste accident. And we are living with those impacts. On the right-hand side, you're going to see some green tanks as well. Those hold waste. So if you've ever seen a well pad, you've probably seen a green tank that looks like this, or one that's on something that looks like stilts. In the past, they were holding waste more often in impoundment ponds. So what they were doing was they were holding waste on private property, in communities, in ponds that were open pits lined with plastic. And the waste, of course, contains all of the things we've talked about. And so there were problems with evaporation of those ponds, air quality issues, leaks. And as some of the smaller drilling companies began to go bankrupt and get bought up by the bigger companies, they often were just filled in. And so we work with a lot of community members, particularly in Washington County, that are living on property with these waste containment ponds just buried in their backyards with fill. We don't even know where the fill came from, right? Whether or not it was uncontaminated soil is a question in itself, but that these folks are drinking well and spring water off of their own land with buried containment ponds that weren't properly cleaned up, and no one's responsible for them. All right, so here's a little more detail about solid waste. The majority of solid fracking waste is sent to municipal landfills and is not considered hazardous under regulation in the state of Pennsylvania. So despite it containing radium, other carcinogens, forever chemicals, metals, salts, benzene, lead, and a plethora of industrial chemicals that we don't know what they are because it's proprietary, it is not considered hazardous in the state of Pennsylvania. So the Solid Waste Management Act and Title 58 in Pennsylvania excludes specifically oil and gas companies from mandated thorough tests or treatment of their waste prior to disposal in municipal landfills. So there is a loophole. It is 30 years old, and there is a loophole that says that other industries have to participate in the Solid Waste Management Act, but we're going to turn a blind eye to the oil and gas industry. And so it's not just about where the waste is ending up. It's about how it's being produced in our communities, how it's being transported, who's transporting it, what workers are neck deep in what they're being told is salt water, and it's not. These are all major issues. And so right now you can help us because State Representative Sarah Innamorato and Senator Katie Muth have introduced legislation that would regulate this waste and close this loophole. There is nothing attached to their bill. It will simply close the loophole, and it will say if your waste is safe and you can prove it through these series of tests that every other industry is required to follow, then you can continue to operate as you are. If it's not safe, then you're going to have to treat it as hazardous waste and ensure that the people of Pennsylvania are not being exposed to dangerous waste and that their constitutional right to clean air and clean water is not being violated. So what happens, right? There's all this waste being produced. We know there's bad stuff in it. How's it going to get into our bodies? So this is a fantastic image that was actually hand drawn by my colleague, Kristen Losey. And what you can see here is a really clear representation of how oil and gas waste is getting into our lives and into our bodies. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that there's a well pad, which we talked about earlier, right? Here's the vertical drilling operation, they're going to go to the side, right? They're going to go out horizontally, sometimes for a mile, very far. And so there's a lot of waste produced. So you can see that brine is being trucked away. That's typically liquid waste. It's not considered hazardous. And so the trucks don't need to be marked. The people driving them aren't told what it is. I've heard stories of truck drivers that are contracted workers that own their own trucks that are hauling for the industry, getting into the backs of their trucks and scraping the scale to clean it out with no respirator, no nothing, right? And then going home with those clothes and their boots out of that truck, right? Exposing their families. We're seeing waste being held in containers waiting to be trucked out. There's a settling pond here, so you can see the radon gas coming off. If you follow the brine truck is headed to the landfill, right? And they're going to dump all that waste into the landfill, both solid and liquid. And of course, radon gas is going to come off of the landfill as well as lead. In addition to that, you're seeing leachate, right? So the leachate is going to come out of the landfill and it's going to leach into the soil around the facility. In addition to that, landfill leachate is taken out of the landfill, right? This is an issue that we know exists. So the leachate pipe is going to go to the municipal wastewater treatment plant and it's going to be treated, but the wastewater plant doesn't even know what they're treating for. So we know that the discharge is not going to be entirely safe, especially whenever we're treating hazardous waste in facilities that aren't meant to treat hazardous waste. And so you can see that the discharge is going into the stream. There's human impacts through the stream, right? There's going to be drinking water intakes out of this stream. Pennsylvania gets their drinking water out of streams, right? Surface water. People are getting their water out of the Monongahela River, and in Canonsburg, it's Chartiers Creek. So you can see here all the human impact down the line. You can see the impact of irrigating water from streams for family farms and local farmers that are feeding us, and their cattle are drinking that water. We're hunting on this land. We're eating the animals that are living off of the land. You can also see where it's being used to salt our roads, right? And you can just imagine runoff is a problem. It's going to leach into the soil. We know that they're using fracking chemicals to derive other products like pool salts and things like that. If they're buying waste to produce pool salts and the waste isn't considered hazardous, you can imagine that the pool salts are going to have radioactive signatures in it and signatures of other chemicals. If you're familiar at all with the situation that happened in Bell Vernon in Washington County, the municipal authority owner essentially blew the whistle and said, my facility is no longer working. The bugs that typically process the waste that's coming in here are all dead. And he shared that whenever he had the water tested, his discharge had so much radium in it that the Federal Nuclear Commission, Regulatory Commission, had to be notified. That was 3 miles up from a drinking water intake on the Monongahela River. This is a major, major problem. Unfortunately, our legislators are not hearing us, and we need all the help we can get. Community members where I live are so economically dependent on industry that they're too afraid to speak out. We've seen situations where families get fired. If I had a brother that worked for industry, they may lay him off because I'm speaking out. People are really trapped and not able to speak out in the way that they deserve. And so we need all the voices we can get to advocate for us. This is really scary stuff, right? There are over 30 cases of Ewing sarcoma among young people and children in southwestern Pennsylvania. There weren't 15 years ago. The Department of Health came to our community in the November of 2019 and told us that the high rates of childhood sarcoma cancers were not statistically significant, while also showing us statistics that showed that there had been a 110% increase in sarcoma cancers in Washington County since 2008, which is, of course, when the fracking boom started, right? So we don't know how much we're being exposed to, whether or not it's making people sick. But we do know that when we ask questions, we don't get many answers. And we do know that there's a loophole on the books that allows them to dump a lot of waste in our communities that is absolutely harmful, regardless if we can prove that it's causing cancer or not. And so You might be sitting here thinking, well, there's no well pads near my house, so it's okay. And the truth is it's not okay, because this is a downstream issue. We all live downstream. We all live within a watershed that is impacted by this waste. And I'm going to help you see some of the ways that there are folks that are impacted by this waste that may not live near fracking. So if you can see here, every dot you see is reflective of waste disposal in your community. So as you can tell, where I live is like literally in this yellow dot, this big one down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And even if you're looking at this map and you're thinking, oh, well, I live over here in North Pittsburgh, there isn't really any disposal close to my home. This is what it looks like when we put our watersheds on. There isn't a single watershed in the state of Pennsylvania that is not being impacted by oil and gas waste. And so when we give this presentation to folks across the state that may live in like the Altoona area or the Laurel Highlands, it can be really upsetting, right? Because there isn't a lot of fracking in those communities, but they are accepting waste because there's so much waste that they don't know what to do with it. And so the impact is extremely broad and the benefit is not. So while there is economic benefit to the oil and gas industry operating in my community, it comes at a very high cost and with very little opportunity to advocate for ourselves. We're often told that we can't prove this, right? There's no proof. No one's ever proved that any of this made anyone sick. Or we don't have enough information to show that fracking is harmful to our health. And the truth is that industry uses that reality in their favor, right? They use the unknown to gaslight us and to make us feel like we don't have enough information to advocate for ourselves. I'm working really hard to empower people to not feel that way, that we are experts in our own communities. We know what our children should have, right? We know what's best for our families. And at the end of the day, we can't be gaslighted into not having enough information to hold a massive industry accountable that's operating in our backyard. And so I work with a lot of mothers, a lot of families whose children have had cancer or have passed away from cancer, to say, whether or not we can prove it is irrelevant, this is harmful. And we're going to do what we can to make sure that our communities are safe and healthy for the families that live here. And so we're shifting the narrative, right? And we need help to do so. And the narrative shift is that what we don't know can really hurt us. And when they're not giving us information about what the waste contains or where it's going or what the discharge point at the landfill contains in terms of radium, if they're not testing their waste to prove it's not hazardous, we don't have enough information to protect ourselves. And so what we're saying is test the waste, give us the information. If it is safe, keep doing what you're doing. If it is not safe, we have a serious problem in our hands and you're going to have to fix it or you're not going to continue to operate in our communities. So the call to action here is that we really need to close the hazardous waste loophole. It's not going to make the waste disappear, but what it will do is it will help us show what type of harms we've been exposed to, and it will help put some safeguards in place to ensure that it doesn't continue to spew across our neighborhoods. So you can see here, just a reiteration that the oil and gas industry has, of course, taken advantage of a loophole that was produced and created just for them to dispose toxic drilling waste, right? Despite oil and gas waste 100% presenting a hazard, the loophole exempts them from all hazardous waste protocols. Other industries in the state are required to follow hazardous waste protocols. The Jiffy Lube by your house is required to follow a hazardous waste loophole, and Range Resources is not. That is infuriating, and it is absolutely terrifying for the people that live here. Given that the industry produces such a large quantity and the pollutants common to oil and gas liquid waste are causing potential health and environmental dangers associated with these facilities, we need to do something about this. And so this means that, of course, as we showed in some of the images, these dangerous pollutants aren't stopping at the landfill. They're not stopping at the well pad. They're not stopping at the pipelines. They're getting into our communities and they're getting into our bodies. If you're familiar with the Environmental Health News's report last year, Christina Marusic did blood test studies of families living near well pads and specifically children. They all had forever chemicals in their blood, upwards of 90% of what the average American should have, living as far as 5 miles from a well pad. There are 10 well pads within a half mile of where I'm sitting right now. I am terrified to get my blood tested. And I can't imagine how those families felt when they got that information back about their children. When they speak out, they're unheard. They don't get listened to. I know families that can't even find a doctor that's willing to give them a blood test for this. We're actually trying to raise money to give people this opportunity because they can't even find a facility that will do it for them. I will drop that in the chat as well, that report, as soon as I'm done presenting. I apologize, but it is very scary and it is absolutely happening, and people are being chastised and their characters are attacked when they speak out. I have myself experienced death threats on social media, in my own community, my own neighborhood, for speaking out. This is very complicated and it's really hard because a lot of people work for the industry and depend on them to keep food on their table. And we didn't get what we signed up for, right? I live on a family farm. Folks came to our farm 10 years ago and told us that this was going to be amazing. It was going to pull us all out of poverty and it was going to go really well. And we haven't gotten what we signed up for. And so we really need help to advocate for ourselves. I'm going to pull Laura in for this part because we're going to talk a little bit about the study, and then Laura is going to share some studies that we already know, right? We already have a lot of information and Laura is going to talk about that. That's her area of expertise. But I appreciate you all listening today. It can be a little emotional, so I apologize for taking up more time than I should have. And I will drop some of those studies in the chat as Laura is presenting as well.
Thank you, Heaven, and thank you, Mia, for pulling us together for this presentation. But as Heaven's last slide there mentioned that, the University of Pittsburgh is conducting 2 studies looking at health impacts in the region, kind of following Heaven and some, CCJ and some other organizations in the area, kind of calling out, saying, we have a problem here. We need some action on it. So, but I'm going to pull up my presentation. Just a minute. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay. All right, so again, I'm Laura. I'm a nurse. I also work for Physicians for Social Responsibility. And so, we can talk about it more at the end of all of this about the studies that the University of Pittsburgh is conducting. And while we're really grateful for the continued research and attention to this issue, the point that I hope you take away from my presentation is that we already have a lot of research and information on the health impacts of fracking. In any field, continued research is necessary and welcomed, and it will build on the body of knowledge we currently have. But what we really want to look at is the overarching themes and trends in the studies, and that should be what guides our decisions. And so a quick note about sort of the role of public health when it comes to environmental exposures. In a lot of other fields of study, you're going to hear that the research needs to prove causation in order to be validated. But that's not always the case with environmental exposures. In fact, it's almost impossible to prove causation due to so many uncontrollable factors influencing results. And, there's ethical considerations as well. When you're doing a study, you can't just take 2 babies and put one near a fracking site and one far away from it and see how they fare. So correlation in the world of environmental health is actually very important and should not be dismissed as not strong enough. So what do we know when it comes to fracking? Well, I think it was just last week, PSR and concerned health professionals of New York released the 8th edition of the Fracking Compendium. And it's a collection of over 2,000 abstracts and has links to medical, scientific, and investigative reports on the consequences of oil and gas drilling and infrastructure. And it's a really great resource for anyone who wants an overview of the research that's out there in fracking. And I'll put a link in the chat to that later. But what was found when, after reviewing all of this research, was that 90% of the research that was done on health impacts showed harm or the potential for harm from fracking. And so, many of these studies were conducted in Pennsylvania, and they show correlations between living and working close to fracking operations and health damage. And this is the 8th edition, so a lot of this has come out in just the past couple of years. But there's continued to be a large and growing body of peer-reviewed evidence linking fracking chemicals, air and water emissions, radioactive waste, and just the stress of living by these facilities to adverse impacts on physical health and mental well-being. And it's important to note that after reviewing all of this literature, the authors, editors of this study concluded that that the examination uncovered no evidence that fracking can be practiced in a manner that does not threaten human health directly or without imperiling climate stability upon which human health depends. So like I mentioned, we want to look at overall trends in the studies. And while I'll be referencing some individual studies that are quite strong, they do represent the overarching theme we are seeing with the research. So symptoms seen. People who live near fracked gas operation report many different adverse health symptoms. There's a study conducted by the Environmental Health Project that listed the top 10 symptoms reported by people living within 1 kilometer or 0.6 miles of shale gas activity in Pennsylvania. Sleep disruption is number 1, is often the result of the nonstop truck activity, the noise, the odors, and light pollution while the well is being drilled and fracked. Headaches and throat irritation are also widely reported. Stress and anxiety are side effects, as I mentioned. And there's also coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, sinus problems, fatigue, and nausea and vomiting. And another study done in Southwest PA by Rabinowitz found dermatological, meaning skin issues and respiratory symptoms that increased in frequency as the distance between household and gas wells decreased. Rashes and upper respiratory issues were more prevalent among people living less than 1 kilometer from drilling and fracking operations. And so this again coincides with the self-reported symptoms that you're seeing here. And that study done by Rabinowitz was the largest of its kind to date. The findings are consistent with earlier reports, and it references literature that demonstrates the biological plausibility between oil and gas activities and the health effects reported. So biological plausibility, let's talk about that. That is, in a lot of evidence-based methods in medicine and other health-related fields have emphasized biological plausibility as an important element in assessing the strength of evidence. And what it essentially says is that what we're seeing in these studies makes sense. The health impacts that are being reported are what you would expect to see if someone was exposed to certain chemicals. And then we also know that these certain chemicals are being generated by oil and gas activities. So it makes these symptoms make sense with what we would expect to see if someone was exposed to these contaminants. So let's talk about some of those chemicals that are released during fracking activity. Many of these produce serious health problems even at low levels of exposure. There is fine and ultrafine particulate matter. And particulate matter that is very small. It means it's small enough to get embedded into the lung. And that can lead to heart and respiratory issues, cancer, and chronic inflammatory disorders. There's volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which can lead to organ disease and cancer. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are endocrine disruptors. They can lead to immune dysfunction and cancer. silica dust, which is known for causing silicosis and other chronic lung disease. There's heavy metals like lead, arsenic, and mercury, which are especially toxic to young children. Then there's T-norms, which is the technologically enhanced, naturally occurring radioactive materials. And that's concerning in all fracking waste because there is no safe level of exposure for humans. There's the ozone forming nitrous oxides, which are respiratory tract irritants, and they also lead to ground level ozone, which impacts everybody's lung function. And of course, greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, and you could give a whole nother presentation on how climate change impacts health. But I don't have time to go into that here. And so there are other fracking health concerns linked to fracking. There was a study done by the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University that found an association with drilling and fracking activity and increased rates of hospitalization in Pennsylvania. So drilling activity increased dramatically alongside inpatient admissions for people living near shale gas wells. Cardiology and neurology inpatient rates were significantly associated with well density, and the inpatient prevalence for cancer, skin issues, and neurological problems also increased. The study observed a control county with no drilling activity during this time period, and no increase in hospitalizations were noted. And fracking threatens drinking water. This is not a contested point. Cases of drinking water sources being contaminated by drilling and fracking activities are proven by the EPA's own assessments. So I know, having mentioned that everyone talks about these studies are done by environmental groups. There are a lot of studies out there that are done by the government that are showing that things like the water is contaminated from fracking. They identified various pathways of exposure, the EPA did through this study, through spills, through discharge of fracking waste into rivers and streams, through intentionally or unintentionally, and underground migration of chemicals, including gas, into drinking water wells. And this is especially concerning for fracking waste to get into drinking water because, again, a study done by the EPA in 2016, they identified over 1,600 chemicals that were used in fracking fluid and found in fracking wastewater. And the agency was only able to find information on like about 173 of these chemicals. So the rest of those chemicals, they're not even sure what the health impacts are because there's no information on it, which is concerning in and of itself. But for the ones that they were able to find information on, that was troubling. They found that health effects associated with chronic oral exposure, so people who would be drinking this water, to these chemicals are cancer causing for things like benzene and radium, which they found. Some of these chemicals cause neurotoxicity, immune system effects, changes in body weight, changes in blood chemistry, liver and kidney toxicity, and reproductive and developmental toxicity. So all these chemicals that are used in the drilling stage and found in wastewater can lead to all these various toxicities and the formation of tumors, according to EPA regulators. So with an increase of rare childhood cancers in the region that coincide along the most heavily fracked counties in the state, the concern for many is wondering if fracking is to blame for these cancers. Have been touched on this before, but the concern is not completely unwarranted. You've probably heard me say the word cancer or carcinogenic about 10 times now. But air pollution and the associated component particulate matter, which I mentioned before, is actually classified as a carcinogen. And so meaning it's linked to causing cancer. And air pollution has been linked directly to lung cancer and has a positive association with bladder cancer. Outdoor air pollution is one of the leading environmental cause of cancer deaths in the United States. But other contaminants from fracking activity are also linked to cancer. There's the VOCs we mentioned, which contain things, which are things such as benzene, and that has a known link to leukemia. As previously mentioned, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, silica dust, and radon, all components that are found to be increased in areas where there is fracking. They're all associated with an increased cancer risk. So again, this is where the biological plausibility comes into play. So we're seeing an increase in substances that cause cancer in an area that's experiencing an increase in cancer. So we don't have direct causation. We don't know for sure that this is the cause, but we can reasonably assume that this correlation is problematic and requires some attention. Some of our other health impacts and some of our strongest research linking fracking to health outcomes has actually been about pregnant women and their babies. And much of that has come out of Pennsylvania. This one personally hits close to home for me. At the moment, I do not live near a fracking site, but I am pregnant and living in Pennsylvania. So just feels extra personal right now. But the studies of mothers living near oil and gas operations consistently find impairments in infant health, including elevated risks for low birth weight and preterm birth. There was a 2017 study of over 1 million infants in Pennsylvania that found poor indicators of infant health, significantly lowered birth weights among babies who were born to mothers living near fracking sites. Another Pennsylvania study found a 40% increase in the risk of preterm birth to mothers who live near active fracking sites. And recent Colorado studies have found neural tube defects and congenital heart defects for those living near fracking sites. And so certain groups are going to be more at risk from health impacts, obviously with women and children, like I mentioned, being at the top of the list, with the main reason for that is, children are still developing, and for women who are growing children. And so some of the chemicals just discharged during fracking operations act as endocrine disrupting chemicals in the body. So even tiny amounts have been shown to interfere with infant growth and child development and are linked to major problems with cognitive and brain development. And this can result in lifelong consequences for children and families. But in addition to mothers and children, older people or those with limited financial resources are more at risk. People of color who often live in environmental justice zones are more at risk. People who have existing medical conditions like chronic lung disease or heart disease, or asthma, they're more at risk for having exacerbations of these diseases. And then of course, industry workers are some of the highest risk people just because they're exposed to it more directly and frequently. So what do we do with this information? Certainly we can conclude that there is enough evidence and research to be concerned about the health impacts of fracking. And while the roles of doctors and nurses, as myself, is to treat an illness, the role of public health, it should be to prevent the illness from occurring in the first place. And both approaches are evidence-based, but the public health decision-making does not rely absolutely on the certainty of causation. Public health decision-making leans on the precautionary principle approach, and that asserts that the burden for proof for potentially harmful actions by industry or government rests on the assurance of safety, and that when there are threats of serious damage or even scientific uncertainty, that must be resolved in favor of prevention. So the core of the precautionary principle is that an action should not be taken if scientific evidence shows uncertainty of the outcome or leans towards the potential for harm. So if there's a plausible pathway of exposure suggesting a public health risk, as we can see that there is with fracking, that is certainly enough to suggest that the exposure risk should be mitigated in favor of public safety. And something like closing the hazardous waste loophole, as Heaven mentioned, is certainly a good start for that. But I know that was a lot of heavy information, and I really hate following up Heaven's presentation with it because there's a lot of research out there, it's heavy stuff. And then there are people who are actually living there, experiencing it daily. And that's heavy too. So hopefully what you took away is that there is research out there to back their concerns, and that their concerns should be listened to. Thank you.
Thank you, Heaven and Laura. That was great, wonderful information. I see, Heaven, you've been answering a lot of the questions in the chat during, so I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions that weren't answered. You could type them in the chat. We have a few minutes left.
Yeah, I would really love if folks leaned in and asked, because, you know, leaving these types of presentations, I can't see a lot of your faces. It's hard, you know, this is hard. I lost a friend to Ewing sarcoma when I was in high school. By the time I graduated from college, there were 3 more just in my school district that were sick. The young people in my community are really scared. They're thinking about cancer in a way that a lot of young people shouldn't be thinking about cancer. You know, when my friend in high school passed away, I'll never forget the day that he was diagnosed. Like, I remember sitting in the cafeteria when they told us that he had a tumor in his back, the size of a baseball, softball. I just remember us all thinking, why didn't we feel it? Why didn't we know it was there sooner? It's really scary. And they told us not to worry because it was rare. And now here we are. And so it's really scary, and it's really hard for folks to live here and think about the impacts, because we don't have a lot of power to do anything about it. And if you're a mother, you can't sit in this, you know, you kind of have to block it out in some ways. But yeah, I dropped my email in the chat. If there are any folks that are, you know, are worried about their water, if they know anybody that's worried about their water, or their air, or anything that's happening, maybe you just found out that I don't know, maybe you saw a range resources sign on the side of the road where you live and you want to know what's going there. I can help. Reach out to us, share my information with anyone that needs it.
Thank you. Thank you, Heaven and Laura. When I was making a Facebook post for this webinar, I found it interesting that we have a file of photos that we looked through from where we developed, and all of the fracking ones I looked up had like pretty blue skies and the sun, and I just found that interesting that just even the pictures were all, I don't know, they made you feel like lighter and like this is a good thing. And so it's great information that I think probably isn't spoken about enough. Thank you. All right, please take a moment to reflect on your experience with the evaluation that comes back. Your response will help us enhance our content and delivery. So be honest and constructive as possible. Typically, I announce our future webinar topics for the speaker series. And right now we're taking a little break for the summer, but we will be back in the fall with more topics for reduction of cancer risks and how it impacts our environment. So please keep an eye out for that. If you'd like more information about cancer and the Environment Network of Southwestern PA, you can also visit the website. It's censwpa.org. We'd love to have more people involved in helping spread the word. So, all right. This concludes today's webinar, and thanks everybody for attending. Thank you, Heaven and Laura, again for your time.